It's one of the reasons why that at 10 of the 11 annual Reagan National Defense Forums, widely regarded as the preeminent international defense gathering in the world, we have welcomed the sitting Secretary of Defense. And this year, we're honored to welcome Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. It is clear that peace through strength has been a guiding principle for Secretary Hegseth, the department he leads, and the Trump administration as a whole. Now, this is the first time that the Secretary has been here as the leader of the Pentagon, but it is not his first time at the Defense Forum. And in fact, as I thought about his keynote address this year, I remembered something he said back in 2018. Quote, "We cannot forget that our military is ultimately what undergirds our strength and our ability to project it." That sounds to me like restoring deterrence with peace through strength. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for joining us today and for joining your predecessors in the finest tradition of the Defense Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the 2025 Reagan National Defense Forum keynote address, followed by a conversation with Lucas Tomlinson of Fox News, please welcome the United States Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. You know, folks in Washington like to invoke President Reagan's name often when they criticize President Trump. They say, or at least insinuate, that Donald Trump is nothing like Ronald Reagan. They say the current president's approach is nothing like the vision championed by Ronald Reagan at the height of the Cold War, as we grappled with the Soviets and ultimately prevailed. But those folks are wrong. They're dead wrong. Most who invoke Ronald Reagan's name today, especially self-styled Republican hawks, are not much like Ronald Reagan. The policies they've championed are nothing like his. In fact, for the better part of 30 years, they've been quite the opposite. If you look at actual policies, Donald Trump is the true and rightful heir of Ronald Reagan. It's President Trump who has inherited and restored President Reagan's powerful but focused and realistic approach to national defense. It's therefore only fitting that we gather at the Reagan Presidential Library today to talk about President Trump's America First, Peace Through Strength, Common Sense agenda and what it means at the Department of War. One need only look at the results to understand why President Trump is that rightful heir. So let's look at what Reagan and his administration actually did. Reagan rebuilt the military after Vietnam, and that is rightfully considered one of his greatest achievements. President Trump has done and is doing the same, making historic investments in defense. But President Reagan also believed sincerely in the peace part of peace through strength, as his actions showed. It was not a popular thing to do at the time, at the height of the Cold War, to talk to communists. Yet President Reagan did. During his high-profile meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev and others, Ronald Reagan saw the prudence and potential in engaging with our nation's adversaries from a position of strength, so he did, even in the face of fierce criticism at home, including from his own party. Now, President Reagan wasn't naive. He recognized that fruitful engagements with our adversaries were only possible from a position of strength, especially military strength, which is why he focused so much on building up the American military. We still talk about the Reagan buildup, and my kids and yours will someday talk about the Trump buildup. President Reagan and his team inherited a military worn down from their generation's endless war in Vietnam. and they took the lessons of that war to heart. This is why he was so deliberate in how he used the joint force. Indeed, the most famous military doctrine of the Reagan administration, named for his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was specifically designed to correct for the failures that led to Vietnam. Among other key principles, the Weinberger doctrine stipulated: 1, the United States should not commit forces to combat unless the vital national interests of the United States or its allies are involved. 2, U.S. troops should only be committed wholeheartedly and with a clear intention of winning. Otherwise, troops should not be committed. 3rd, U.S. combat troops should be committed only with clearly defined political and military objectives and with the capacity to accomplish those objectives. And 4th, the commitment of U.S. troops should be considered only as a last resort. This is sound stuff, and it was reflected in how President Reagan actually used the American military, namely in a focused, decisive manner, and only when he determined that it was in our nation's vital interest to do so. In fact, throughout his time in office, President Reagan only committed U.S. ground forces twice, in Grenada and in Lebanon. Otherwise, he focused the joint force on the Cold War-era threat and priority theater, Soviets in Europe. That's how President Reagan achieved peace through strength, always with a clear eye toward lasting peace. Suffice it to say, Ronald Reagan's disciplined, focused, and realistic approach was a far cry from the grandiose, nation-building, moralistic, and rudderless wars that many of his self-described acolytes led us into in the decades after Reagan left office. Wars my generation fought in. Indeed, it's only under President Trump's leadership during his first term and now that we've been able to restore America's greatness after years of suffering under the so-called bipartisan consensus, which is really just a euphemism for disastrous foreign policy. Out with utopian idealism, in with hard-nosed realism. To be specific, Ronald Reagan taught us the value of focused, powerful leadership, but his so-called disciples didn't heed that lesson. Since the end of the Cold War, a generation of self-proclaimed neo-Reaganites have touted Reagan's name, but didn't govern like him. All the bluster, none of the clarity. That's especially true in the military realm. This generation of self-proclaimed neo-Reaganites abandoned Reagan's actual wise policies in favor of unchecked neoconservatism and economic globalism. In economics, they dismantled our industrial base, shipping it overseas. At the same time, in diplomacy and defense, they swore off the clear-eyed, flexible realism of Reagan, Nixon, and Eisenhower. Instead, they set about trying to make America the policeman, the protector, the arbiter of the whole world. Democracy for all, they say, even in the Pesh River Valley. Even when people don't want it, can't do it. They turned American allies into dependents, all but encouraging these nations across Europe and around the world to free ride while we subsidize their defense with U.S. taxpayer dollars. These self-described neo-Reaganites sought global military hegemony under the auspices of peace through strength. Instead, we got rudderless wars in the Middle East, land war in Europe, and the economic rise of China. After presiding over such a poor performance, it's remarkable that these people still think they're qualified to speak in public, let alone moralize to the rest of us. Some of them have even been awarded for it on this very stage. But President Trump knows better. He knows what it means to restore peace through strength on an enduring basis, to put our nation's interests first and the American people first in a way that is practical, applicable, and common sense, that leaves, importantly, America better, but also leaves our allies better off. It's the vision that he ran on and led on in his first term, and he's building on it now in his second. In It's a vision, not the quasi-imperialist delusions that led us to so many disasters in the recent decades, that will actually bring us back to the true legacy of Ronald Reagan. Out with utopian idealism, in with hard-nosed realism. Just look at the facts. Like President Reagan, President Trump is dedicated to both sides of the peace through strength coin, not just using that phrase as a thin veil for warmongering. In less than a year, President Trump has secured 8 major peace deals, including a historic end to the war in Gaza. And he's not finished yet. Even as we speak, under the president's leadership, we are working tirelessly to end the tragic war in Ukraine, a war that never would have started in the first place if he had been president. The world sees an entirely different America today. These historic opportunities for peace are not happening by chance. It's President Trump's vision and determination. Like President Reagan, President Trump is willing to talk to rivals, from Mikhail Gorbachev to Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping today. This is born of strength, not weakness. It is born of clarity of purpose. Folks in Washington like to criticize President Trump for doing so, but those critics forget that this is exactly what Ronald Reagan did. And America was better off for it. Like President Reagan, President Trump also knows how important it is to negotiate from a position of strength, especially military strength. And at the newly renamed Department of War, thanks to President Trump's leadership and to Congress, we received a historic boost in funding last year and believe that is only just the beginning. Make no mistake about it, President Trump is hell-bent on maintaining and accelerating the most powerful military the world has ever seen. The most powerful, the most lethal, and American-made. The arsenal of freedom. We're also restoring the warrior ethos back to basics: readiness, accountability, standards, discipline, lethality. I'm not sure if you saw, but I recently gave a speech on that topic to a few generals in Quantico. The War Department is the sword and the shield of peace through strength. We are the Strength Department, and we stand ready to wield that sword as President Trump directs. The opposite of peace through strength is war through weakness. Wokeness, weakness, and war. All specialties of Joe Biden and Lloyd Austin. The debacle in Afghanistan, a stain on our country and a sin committed against the troops. The weakness that unleashed Islamist war against Israel on October 7th. And that same weakness invited war in Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin saw the open door and he took it. Spy balloons flying over our country and SecDefs going AWOL for a week. Wokeness, weakness, war. You know, I was recently tempted when the discussion went out about hitting drug boats to use the phrase righteous strike. But then my team counseled me against it and said, "Sir, that's the phrase that was used by Mark Milley when a family of Afghans was struck as a response to what happened at Abbey Gate. They called it for 2 straight days a righteous